Hey guys, so today we're going to be doing a comparison between the cameras on my iPhone XS Max and my DSLR, the Canon 6D Mark II. And the reason why I'm doing this test is not so much to prove that one is better than the other, but I'm really just doing this out of my curiosity because, as we all know, smartphone cameras have been getting better and better every year, and we've been getting a lot of new and exciting features like the portrait mode, portrait lighting, and the smart HDR with the new iPhones. And meanwhile, on the other hand, in the photography world, things haven't been as exciting, to say the least. Not a lot of people buy digital cameras anymore. Digital camera sales have been going down pretty much every single year since the launch of iPhone. And there are several reasons for that. Camera gears are quite expensive. Cameras cost a lot of money. Camera lenses cost a lot of money. And they're much more difficult to use than any modern smartphones where you just basically open up a camera app and tap the screen. So there's a bit of a learning curve there also. So you have to spend some money and time before you get to start to produce any good results. So nowadays, more and more people are taking great photos with their smartphones and easily sharing them on social media with their family and friends, but lesser and lesser people are buying cameras, which is quite ironic. But it also kind of makes sense because with smartphone cameras being this good, like why would anybody ever need a real camera? So that's what I'm here to find out. But you see, as a photographer and an enthusiast, if you will, I already have a pretty good idea of when and where a DSLR might outperform a smartphone. Obviously, the DSLRs being DSLRs, you can change the lenses, you can use external flash. DSLRs have much better autofocusing systems, so they're much better at taking photos of fast-moving subjects. And also with much bigger sensors, they generally perform better in low light. But I've never done any side-by-side comparisons before, so I thought it would be pretty interesting to see. But before we begin, just know that I'm only comparing one smartphone to one DSLR because there are obviously many different types of DSLRs and mirrorless cameras out there nowadays, and also there are many different smartphones, so there's really no point leaving comments like,
"Oh, if you used A7R3, the low light performance would have been so much better. Oh, if you used Google Pixel 3, it has much better dynamic range."
I know, and like I said, I'm not trying to prove that one is better than the other. And also keep in mind that 6D Mark II is one of the worst cameras that you can buy when it comes to image quality. I'm not saying all the photos that you get with this camera are terrible, but if you're a photographer who likes to fiddle with things in post, like pulling out shadows and highlights, then this may not be the best camera for you. The 6D Mark II is the camera that can do everything well enough, not one thing really well. So here are things that we already know. The iPhone XS Max has two 12 megapixel sensors, and the 6D Mark II has a 26.2 megapixel sensor. One of the 12 megapixel sensors on the iPhone XS Max is paired up with a 26mm f1.8 wide-angle lens, and on the 6D Mark II, obviously you can use whatever lens you want, but I'm using my 16-35 f4 IS and the 28mm f1.8 to mimic the wide-angle lens on the iPhone XS Max. And also on the iPhone XS Max, the other 12 megapixel sensor is paired up with a 51mm f2.4 portrait lens. And on the 6D Mark II, I'm using my Canon 50mm 1.4 to test against the iPhone XS Max's portrait lens. The reason why I'm using this lens is because in the portrait mode in the iPhone XS Max, now you can adjust the background blur after you take a photo, and you can change the aperture all the way up to 1.4. So I thought it would be interesting to see what 1.4 looks like on a real camera. All the photos were taken handheld to mimic the real world scenarios, and I took multiple photos with both cameras to make sure I got the best results with both cameras. The iPhone XS Max's photos were taken with smart HDR turned on. With the 6D Mark II's examples, I'm going to be showing the raw original images straight out of the camera, and I'm also going to be showing you the revised image to mimic the HDR capabilities of the iPhone. I thought that would be fair because if you're buying a $2,000 camera to shoot RAW, then you're probably always going to be revising your photos before you do anything with them. So let's get started. So here are my first examples. I have the photo from the XS Max on the left and the 6D Mark II's photo on the right. And as you can see, the color is much more saturated on the iPhone XS Max, while on the 6D Mark II, this being a raw image straight out of the camera, things are looking quite flat. But with some light retouching, we can bring out the shadows and colors much more. And if you zoom in, as you can see, the 6D Mark II's image is much sharper, but if you're looking at these images on your phone, you probably won't be able to tell the difference. The next examples are much more similar to each other, and I'm showing you the revised version of the 60 Mark II's photo only because the original photo really didn't look any different. The iPhone XS Max again did a great job showing the color and the sharpness of the rock, and although the clouds were looking a little flat here, I think if this was a blind test, I don't think many people will be able to tell the difference. On the next photos, there's a bit of a difference in color like we saw on the first examples, but other than that, at a first glance, there's not much difference here. But when you zoom in, the 60 Mark II's photo is retaining a lot more detail, this being a 26 megapixel sensor and probably because of the better lenses. Also, the difference in sharpness in the background is much more noticeable. On the next example, I wanted to test out the HDR capabilities of the iPhone, and here we have some bright skies and shadowy areas, so it was quite tricky to properly expose the photo, but the iPhone did a great job balancing out those highlights and shadows. And the 60 Mark II's photo, although it looks kind of terrible here, this being a raw photo, it can be easily revised as shown here. And next we have more examples of high contrast images here, and again the iPhone did a great job balancing out the shadows and highlights, whereas the 60 Mark II's photo looks both overexposed and underexposed, but then again this can be easily fixed in post. The next photos were taken by 50mm portrait lenses, and there isn't a ton of difference here other than the fact that there's a lot of background blur happening on the 60 Mark II because I'm shooting at f1.4, but iPhone again did a great job with the exposure and everything looks pretty good. And here is the slightly revised photo from the 60 Mark II. And for the next examples, I took photos of my dog sleeping in my living room, and I dimmed down the lights to the lowest settings, and I took this photo just as a reference to show you guys what the room looked like with my own eyes. And here are the two photos, and here the iPhone did a really good job. And based on my experience with the phone so far, as long as there's not a lot of movement, the low light photos come out really well because you're using slower shutter speed. And also on the 60 Mark II, there's not a ton of difference in sharpness here, other than the fact that there's a lot of background blur happening because I'm shooting at 1.8, and the photo came out a lot brighter because I'm shooting at ISO 16000, but I could probably lower that just a bit to match the brightness of the photo from the iPhone XS Max, and then I'll probably gain a little more sharpness. Now let's finally look at the portrait mode examples. This is my friend Michael, and he's a vegetarian, so I thought he would be a perfect candidate for this test. Here I took one photo of Michael with my iPhone XS Max, and I'm adjusting the aperture after I took the photo, and I'm matching them up with the different aperture levels with my DSLR to see what the differences are. And here, as you can probably see right away, the iPhone's portrait mode at f1.4, it looks quite weird. His hat and the edges of his shirt are quite fuzzy, and also if you zoom in, his beards on his cheeks are also quite blurry. As we go down to f2.8, things are looking much better on the iPhone's photo. His hat and his shirt are looking much better, although his beards are still blurred. Same image at f4, 5.6, and at this point both photos look pretty good, although on the iPhone photo his beards are still messed up. And here's f8, f11, and finally f16. So what did we learn from this test? I think most photos came out as the way I would expect them to. The 60 Mark II's photos were generally sharper and they were better in low light, but iPhone photos straight out of the camera had better color and did much better job with the exposure. So do I think smartphone cameras are good enough to replace real cameras now? In some cases, maybe. I think for most people who are going to be looking at their photos on their smartphone screens, I think smartphone cameras will be good enough for most things, and they will continue to get better every year. But this is a pointless test anyway, because if you're a professional photographer, it's not like you're going to ditch all your camera gears and start shooting your weddings with smartphones. And it's not like average smartphone users are going to go out and buy $2,000 cameras after watching this video. But I thought this was an interesting experiment, and I hope it was for you too. So that's it for today, and thank you very much for watching. And as always, don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.